Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to have Jahan and Ross with us today. We were just talking about quantum hermeticism, and we'll kind of jump into that here. Good to have you, Jahan.
Hey, good to have you. Good to be here.
And yeah, it's it's fascinating the stuff that you deal with, you talk about, and I'm just going to sit back and let you kind of delve into some of these topics here. And if you want, we could just jump back into quantum hermeticism, the principle of vibration, and
yeah, we should probably explain to the audience how this whole thing came about too.
Yeah, I noticed this book came out like 1900, originally came out in early 1900s. Is that correct? Am I
correct?
Right about
1908.
That? Wow.
So the newer book came out in 2018 though, so.
Okay. So yeah, it looks like they were not really necessarily borrowing from you, but they were like, you guys are sharing your viewpoints of quantum mechanics and idealism.
And then they were going further than that. It was actually, it went on like 2017. I had this really nasty kind of midlife crisis or breakdown in LA, and I was depressed and bedridden. I really wasn't in a position to like look at this thing, but this was being passed around at my Idealism and Science versus Atheism board back in 2018 or so, right? And it was right when it came out apparently. And at first I thought, oh, this is just some kind of new age woo that's being kind of the fad of the day or whatever. I'm like, I didn't really look into it because I was too busy dealing with other stuff at the time and being dealing with this psychological midlife crisis thing at the time. But I finally got around to looking into it, and Kyle started making videos on this, right? And that's when I started perking up, and I'm like, well, this is interesting. And I look into this, and it turns out that they're using essentially number one, it's I looked at the book, and my first thought is this is going to be new age woo, right? But it's not woo. Now, it could be giving a wrong theory of the world, but it gives a very precise, it makes specific statements, scientific statements that you could test in the laboratory and so on, and that are, very precise statements. And moreover, then I look at the actual model, and it was identical to my model. And not only that, but when you look at the book, it's like barely even 100 pages long. For that 100 pages, it has 172 scientific references in it. And I read the thing; it's a scientific argument they give in the book for essentially trying to break down Hermeticism principle by principle and reverse engineer every piece of it from physics. Yeah, so I was able to get a hold of them. Kyle talked to them too briefly as well. But I was able to get a hold of them, and I talked to them. It turns out they were actually directly influenced by myself on YouTube. And what they did then was they simply took it to the next step, and they said they tried to derive Hermeticism from it, and they not only derived it, they showed a direct parallel. Maybe they showed it's the same model, talking the same thing. And so they derived Hermeticism as a system, like kind of an occult system from quantum idealism.
Wow. So do these guys have a background in physics and stuff, or are they just like layman's?
Yeah, they have a background in physics.
Oh, wow.
Yep. Ethan and Olivia Palmer. So
incredible. So let's see
here,
that's at least
who they call themselves on the, I don't know if that's the real name or whatnot, but
And so let's say, like, jumping or springboarding off of that, like, so what's the best model of the universe do you hold to, like Donald Hoffman's idea, digital physics, hologram, a dream?
That's basically what Hoffman's conscious realism, in my view, is a different variation on my quantum idealism. I mean, they get to the same conclusion that consciousness equals entanglement. I go from a different way. I go from Giulio Tononi's approach, where entanglement is identical to integrated information, whereas Hoffman doesn't like the integrated information approach, but he still gets to entanglement equals consciousness nonetheless. And then we simply, in both cases, it just gets snapped back into the emergent space-time from entanglement picture. So when you say emergent space-time from entanglement, well, entanglement equals consciousness, so you now have emergent space-time from consciousness. So it's a universe is a simulation in a larger conscious agent.
I would say that's more like a virtual reality. Does that kind of align with
it? Yeah, it's I mean, it's not exactly a virtual reality in the way that you would say a computer game, but it's close enough in that, a computer game is kind of seen as an illusory reality or whatever, right? Where in this, it's also an illusory reality. All the physical properties that you see around you, space, time, matter, and energy, all of those things are not fundamental. They're emergent from this deeper level of reality. And at that level, none of those things actually exist. And then when you say, well, what does it emerge from? Or, what is it an illusion of? It's made out of information.
Now, talking about,
I think it's like a virtual reality again. You get your computer game generated from information in the hard drive. So.
Right. So I heard IP talking about this, that whenever your consciousness or we observe something like a quantum computer lights up or something, like, is that how like a hard drive of a quantum computer is that how you would look at it too? Or?
Yeah, because the universe literally is a quantum computer. So yeah, you might say it's a quantum computer simulation in God's mind.
Incredible. So how do you get from like entanglement to consciousness, like an immaterial consciousness? What if you have like a materialist would say, well, no, that's just atoms and neurons working together, and that's just the physical brain.
They're not solving the hard problem. They're not really getting that. I mean, it can't be neuron. I mean, neurons obviously mediate it, but it's not the full picture because neurons are emergent, right? I mean, a neuron is a cell, and cells are made of biomolecules, and but those are made out of chemicals, which are made out of atoms, which are made out of subatomic particles, and so on, right? So you go on. I mean, so a neuron cannot be. It's mediating the entanglement, and there was a University of Dublin paper recently that showed this. They found evidence of entanglement in the brain, and it was a very mainstream. Wow. Yeah, our brains use quantum computation. It's called some.
And let's say, well, maybe they're not physicalists. What if they say this is just a natural phenomenon, not a mental phenomenon? Like it's more.
Well, no, the idea is that when you say we dichotomize, like that's a false dichotomy, because like the idea with this is that you have people like to say that natural equals physical equals material, right?
Right.
And so the problem with that is that you have a couple of equations there. That natural, in one sense, in the most basic sense, just means everything is described by scientific laws, right? And if that's what you know, a naturalism, I'm fine with that. I'm a naturalist by that definition. The problem is they then want to equate everything is explainable by scientific laws with everything is material. Like only the scientific laws only apply to the material. They don't apply to anything else, and therefore everything else doesn't exist. So, yes, you have this situation where with this, you've kind of broken Hempel's dilemma, as it were, instantiated Hempel's dilemma, where you have a natural thing that is explained by scientific laws that is non-material, and not only that, but the material doesn't even exist.
Right. And so I guess Doki kind of has a question. This is
going. Oh yeah, do you see the double slit experiment as good evidence for God? Maybe not direct. If you kind of extrapolate through a little bit, yes. I mean, directly it's just basic quantum mechanics, but so I wouldn't say by itself good evidence for God, but it's a starting point to an argument, you might say.
Like through the observer's effect, would you say?
Yeah, the observer, exactly. That way, if you bring in, the whole point that collapse is relative to frame, then you can get to that answer.
So I look at quantum information as fundamental and as a medium of consciousness. And do you see it the same way, and why?
Yeah, I actually will identify. Sorry.
No.
You can use little potato chips here. Identify a consciousness with information. That's the whole idea of integrated information theory.
Interesting. So I think we just kind of answered this, that quantum mechanics can show the mind as immaterial, or that mind is fundamental. Everything derives from mind. And is that typically how idealism is defined, or is there different types of idealism that
Yeah,
doesn't
well,
entail that?
idealism, generally speaking, means that everything is derived of minds and thoughts. So anything that is like a mental ontology, the world has a mental ontology, which means minds or thoughts in minds.
Aha, okay. In one of your videos I was watching, and I think it's digital physics or maybe something after that, but there was something about reality being pixelated, like a movie, like that movie. There was a movie called Pixels or something, and they were showing like little bits of pixels. Is that how you would look at it still, or is that changed kind of?
Well, space is quantized, so in that sense, yes.
Oh, okay.
Because when the space isn't even really there when you're not looking at it. It's the whole point of it being emergent. You're rendering up the environment, and so it's there is a reality there behind that, but the reality is not the space itself. It's what's generating the information, which is the entanglements behind it. It's the program. The program is fundamental, and the program is definitely quantized, but the program is not even space until you look at it. It's the space is in the observation itself. So,
does mind render this script or this reality that?
Well, our minds do. And now remember, people often make a misconception with this, and then it gets attacked by the skeptics and all this. And what they say is, well, no, conscious doesn't collapse reality because the measuring apparatus does that. You're not observing reality; you're measuring it, and it's not a human doing it. It's a measuring. Well, that's true, but the thing with that is then, well, who collapses the wave function of the measuring apparatus? And they're going to say, well, the environment does. But then, well, who collapses the wave function of the environment? Right? It's relative to frame, and so yes, consciousness, because consciousness has a frame, will collapse a wave function, but so does everything else. Everything else is able to collapse a wave function with respect to its own frame, and so yes, it's true that consciousness collapses the wave function with respect to its own reference frame, but then so does everything else. So it's not like it's just your mind doing it. It's not that mind is in that sense spooky or something. It's that consciousness has a reference frame. Everything has a reference frame, and all you need to collapse a wave function is a reference frame. So everything with a wave function, everything with a reference frame will collapse the wave function, and minds are among those things which have reference frames.
Gotcha. So is this directly related to the von Neumann chain and the measurement problem, like the infinite regress?
Okay. Exactly.
So, I mean, they would have to invoke some type of infinite regress to like try to solve that. So basically there has to be a non-local observer to collapse the wave function or the final wave function. Is that the way you look at it too, or am I characterizing?
Well, final with respect to what reference frame, I would ask. But you would have a top, there would be an ultimate frame of reference which has all the other reference frames in it, I suppose. So
right, so like
reality behind the whole system.
We would collapse the wave function locally, but then like non-locally, say we would. This is what Michio Kaku is stating in one of his videos. That's like with the Schrodinger's.
Oh yes, the Wigner's friend. Or not the Wigner's friend thought experiment.
Yeah, that like what makes you real? What makes the next person
real? You have this big overmind that contains the whole system.
He calls it ethereal mind. That's incredible, Michio Kaku.
Yep.
I don't understand. Is he an atheist or like I don't understand?
I don't know. He does not identify himself as an atheist, and he calls himself like either a pantheist or like he's. I mean, he doesn't really think of himself along divided by those lines, but he's not an atheist proper. He says he believes in the God of Spinoza. Everyone says the God of Spinoza is pantheist, but then the other day Bernardo Kastrup came out and he made a paper and he said, well, no, Spinoza was not actually a pantheist like everyone assumes. Spinoza was an idealist, and you can see this in his writings.
Wow.
Yeah.
And speaking of people like Bernardo Kastrup, and how is he a theist? And how do we get to the Christian God?
Bernardo Kastrup is a theist, yes.
Okay. Does he subscribe to like one of the major religions, or does he have?
No, he's just a generic theist. He's like a philosophic theist. Idealism. He doesn't consider himself religious though. So.
Oh, okay. And can we get to the Christian God through quantum idealism?
Okay, so with that, when you say Christian, well, what do you mean by so? This is what I've noticed with this. Now, you can say like what makes a religion? It really boils down to what makes a religion true. What would you think makes a religion true per se?
I I would say their tenets and their doctrinal viewpoints. If they or maybe like prophecy and some of these other things that you can test and see if it has any accuracy to it.
Well, a lot of religions are prophecies, though, and a lot of them come true. And you can have a
Yeah.
mechanism for prophecy in the physics. I mean, it's
Oh
like
wow.
precognition, right? That's one of the things that people this book pointed out. It's time like entanglement. So the thing with it is like let's imagine that you have a whole bunch of religions on the table, and all of them have some false doctrines. One of them has like say you have one that has right on soteriology, but it's wrong on some minor doctrine. Would you
Right.
consider that religion true still?
Yeah. Yeah.
There we go. Okay, so it's not true in a dogmatic sense of like every last individual thing in it is true, but it is true in the sense of like the thing that makes the religion true is in religion you have this notion of a there's like something that you're on the other side of something that has to be fixed, right? So like in the Abrahamic religions, it's the fallen state, right, or the sin or whatever. In Buddhism, it's ego consciousness. In Hinduism, it's the state of duality, right? And so the goal of the religion is to get to the other side of that somehow, right? And so then the question is, and then and it's kind of funny that the quantum hermetica people, they had a whole thing on this where they tried to derive pieces of religion from this, and actually showed that that thing in religion that you're supposed to get to the other side of, it's actually the same thing being described in like 6 major religions, right? And when you get to the other, but it's actually describing the same thing. It's different descriptions of the same thing. And so then the question is, well, what gets you to the other side of it? So no, I had a video once with Kyle on this on it's the problem of religious pluralism. I wanted to make this into a proper video at some point, but it was for now it's just on this hangout. And basically, you show that it doesn't say Jesus, but basically it has like a divine avatar doing the kind of things Jesus would do to break through.
Right.
So that in that sense, yes. Of course, then you could imagine that system becoming wildly heterodox. You could have you know you could have like the afterlife story completely upside down, right? Like you could have like heaven and hell taken over to the Hindu side, and then reincarnation taken over to the
Yeah.
Abrahamic side, right?
Right.
But you could have any number of those kinds of things, and it doesn't say anything about those doctrines, right? It doesn't. I mean, that's a whole other issue. But so saying whether a religion is true, you'd have to more say whether the soteriology is true, because that makes the religion true. But beyond that, it couldn't really say anything beyond a specific doctrine. Like science is not in the business of saying this religion is true as a whole, but you could say it says this doctrine. Could you prove this doctrine true? Proving this, and with an old school materialist versus dualist approach, no, you couldn't. But with an idealist approach, maybe you could, because God is suddenly inside the science.
Okay, gotcha. You have a question here. Are biophotons generated from the body through absorption of the rays of the sun, or are they generated from the body autonomously?
That I do not know. I actually have to research biophotons more to answer that properly. Sorry.
I don't even know what a biophoton is, so you have another question here. Do you have predictions of the future of humanity, like in the new AI?
Uh I don't know. I've heard that the current chat GPT is like as smart as like a small child or something like that, or maybe like 100th the intelligence of a human, but those things scale up pretty fast. They're saying something like we should probably hit human level intelligence with AI in like 10 years, 15 years, something like that.
Oh
So
wow, okay.
wait and see what's up with that, which would be kind of interesting. I think that's kind of cool. Now, there is a worry of what happens when you get smarter than a human, because you've seen Elon Musk online where he has that. They asked ChatGPT to this really ridiculous poem. He was asked to make a poem about it taking over the world, and it sounded rather unhinged.
He has some funny things that he says at Elon Musk. Um, So, like, people like Sean Carroll, they seem to be a big impediment for a theist, and maybe some of his arguments might actually can be taken the other way. Like, do you think Hilbert space? He has something called Hilbert space. Do you think that invokes like idealism, or is that indicative of something that would lead to idealism?
Well, he would probably take it in a very instrumental approach, which I think is kind of stupid because, I mean, last year's Nobel Prize was given out showing that there is, reality is non-local. It's not spatial fundamentally. And whatever that fundamental reality is, a non-local reality is Hilbert space.
Okay. So when we talk, so like when we say the universe, space, time, and matter is emergent from quantum information, is that the same thing as saying that this reality is emergent from a greater reality? Is that like the same thing?
Yeah.
And we would call, as Christians, we would say heaven, or where God abodes. And is that the way you look at it too?
You could say, well, think about it like this. This is the hard drive that everything builds up from, and the hard drive is, that's God's mind. So, and then inside there is our universe.
Some atheists, they say like, is God a mind, or is he a being with a mind, or are they both true?
Both true. It's when you say that you have a mind, you really saying that you are a mind. I is a mind, right?
Right.
The Descartes cogito, the I there is a mind, but you say you have an I, but you are an I.
I see. Okay, I think I get what you're saying there.
Check your chat on the Facebook side, Tom.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I want to get into hermetics here too. I want to kind of focus on that. But my last question here is, what's your favorite philosophical argument for idealism?
I would probably say my introspective argument that the mind is immaterial, dualism is false, and therefore, like the mind is a fundamental substance, right? Substance dualism is false, and therefore the only substance that exists is mind.
Oh, okay.
It's super simple. Like it's both premises are intuitive. You put them together, you get like this very powerful statement about reality just that quickly from your own deduction.
And it's on your like Facebook page. I want people to check out your Facebook page because you have some pretty cool stuff on there. I always like to check out that you guys speak on like another level on stuff. Sometimes it's hard to follow, but it's really cool. Do you have like those arguments on there?
Sometimes, yeah. We talk about lots of things. I've been talking about politics recently, so. But yeah, that idealism comes up oftentimes too.
So we could go into now like Hermeticism, the principle of vibration. Can you go into what that entails, or like what's that? What does that mean? Like principle of vibration, and does that mean like with people like Michio Kaku, and they say like there's the string theory? Is that has something to do with string theory? Or?
It can, but I mean, Michio Kaku, there's another clip of him. I actually played it in the Kabbalian's vibration enigma, where he said, the wave function is a wave of vibration. So okay. It's just the Schrodinger equation, right? It says everything has a associated wave function.
Gotcha. So here we have your Kabbalian's vibration enigma right here, your video, and this is.
Just scroll back a little bit in time on that.
Okay.
Yeah. So basically, yeah. So it's this system called the Now this is kind of I want to warn, this is kind of a hybridized version of Hermetics. Like the older Hermetic texts don't have vibration apparently, but that doesn't really matter because it's kind of they actually got it from Hinduism, believe it or not. Yeah, it's Johann Ratz, the same as my name.
Yeah, so he has like 10,000. You had like 12,000 followers or something, I think, as far as I know.
Like 10,000.
Okay.
Almost 11,000. Or not little whiles out will be 11,000. And so it's the Kabbalion, it turns out, well, depending on where we don't know exactly who. We have an idea who might have wrote it, but we don't know for certain. But the idea is that it might be a hybridization of older Hermetic texts with some material from Hinduism. And it turns out then after that the two might actually be coming from the same source, because it's you look back into Hinduism, it's the world's oldest religion, right? Oldest living religion, rather.
Yeah.
And whereas Egypt, Hermeticism, it kind of has roots in ancient Egyptian religion. But you look back into both those cultures, and they both go back to the origins of like known history, right? And one thing that's interesting about that, though, is they've discovered these temple designs on both sides of, like, literally all over the world, including both sides of the Atlantic. They call them triptych temples, where they have these two smaller doorways and they have a larger doorway, and they have in the middle, and there's usually some kind of other symbolism about it. And they call this the triptych temple in archaeology. And what they found is that this same design shows up on both sides of the Atlantic, and it also shows up in like East Asia. And then two other places it shows up are in Egypt and India. And so the argument is that this is deriving from the same source. And so instead of this being a kind of a bastardized hybrid of these two systems, it's actually recovering a much older system. And of course, they could just be having to have the same cultural influence going from way back from this, unknown civilization that, the source of these triptych temple designs. And then they're, developing their systems of religion independently. But the problem with that is it turns out that part of the Hermetic ideas are actually encoded into the triptych temple design itself. And the reason we know this is, believe it or not, these triptych temple designs showed up in Europe in Catholic cathedrals during the Middle Ages.
Wow, man.
You know how that got there? This is real spooky. There's actually a trace. It has to do with who they hired to build the cathedrals, and it turns out this source may actually be like one of the last few relics of whatever civilization that was the source of the triptych temple. The triptych temple culture, we'll call it. And so basically, during the Middle Ages, the cathedrals were the Catholic Church commissioned the Freemasons to build the temples, the cathedrals. Now, then they discover there's some things that are sketchy about the Freemasons. And they're like, okay, we're not going to like you anymore, but we're going to still keep our cathedrals. And so because of that, they then also encoded symbolism into it. And basically what it showed was that the two smaller doors on the side were meant to be male and female respectively, and the middle one in the center was God. And the idea was that it was showing gender being emanated from God. You start, and the two pieces merge back together, and they're back closer to God now again. And so it's kind of a Neoplatonic emanation thing, where remember that whole thing with Plato, where he's like, there's like a single soul up in heaven, and then it gets like split in half, and it goes down here. The two halves of the male and the female. Well, that actually is something called the androgyne, and it shows up in that same pattern. I mean, in the Bible, you even see that. There's, you start with a single being before, in creation, right? And then Eve is taken out of Adam's rib, right? Like Eve is the rib. You pull Eve out, she becomes a woman, and they were before they were a single united being,
right?
Well, that's the androgyne in, the Old Testament in the Judaism. And you see a similar thing in Colossians 1:17-19, where Jesus, it says like Christ is the head of. Christ, in him all things hold together, and he is also the head of the church. Well, in Christianity, the church is female, and Christ is male. Right, that's the husband and the wife. And then, well, you look at it in a different respect. Well, in him all things hold together. That's look at it kind of a idealist lens. That's God's mind containing everything. And it turns out that same principle, that same concept shows up in Hermeticism again. That's the thing with there's God's mind, and the inside God's mind is this, call it mental gender, basically. The interior of God's mind is female, and the two merge then. And so they have this thing called the principle of gender, where everything is like emanating out from God. The genders are the result of God emanating. And so this same principle, though, shows up in every major religion. Islam has a version of it. pretty much along Plato's lines. Hinduism has a version of it, very explicitly stated, actually. And then Buddhism has one, and then it's a thing that shows, and then it shows up in a bunch of like extinct religions as well. Egyptian mythology has it. Sumerian mythology has a version. It's pretty ubiquitous across the board, but it's also encoded in this triptych temple design, and it's those are two Hermetic principles, and explains how one of the Hermetic principles derives from the other one. And so, because of that, it's kind of interesting because it's what's being encoded in the triptych temple design is Hermetics, and it's found all over the world, and it comes from that whatever culture happened to propagate the triptych temple design.
Wow, that's incredible, the parallels there. Wow, I had no idea.
Yeah, and so when you say, well, no, it's these two separate systems and you're combining them, well, sort of true, but what you don't realize is those two separate systems have a same common origin. And so what's really going on is we're combining pieces of a very large puzzle that's spread over thousands of years and multiple civilizations, and you're putting the puzzle back together.
Right.
And I mean, there's a tremendous amount of overlap between like the metaphysics in Hinduism and the metaphysics in Hermeticism or like ancient Egyptian thought. I mean, the religions aren't exactly the same. There's a lot of difference, but in terms of the metaphysics of it is pretty similar.
Wow. Okay. And so all this, like, it reveals like an idealistic reality that even in, no matter how we look at it, that reality really is mental, or it comes back to a universal mind. Is that
right?
Is that basically okay?
Yeah. So the thing with the vibration, though, what was very curious about this, and this is one of the parts of the book that I found to be absolutely fascinating when I saw it. They show basically that what they're describing. So remember, this Kybalion book was written in 1908. Okay. And at that time, they did not have quantum mechanics. They didn't have entanglement, any of that. Quantum mechanics was first discovered in 1926. And so they have this wave function thing, right? But firstly, they say everything vibrates, right? Well, in 1908, you really wouldn't know that. And we know probably everything moves because there's thermodynamics. The heat is basically motion of a lot of small particles. And you have Brownian motion, which is the same thing applied to, stuff in like liquids and so on. Oh, sun resting on the moon shows up everywhere in Catholicism. Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, it's actually the sun and the moon. The sun is seen as masculine and the moon is feminine. That's the symbol they showed up on the cathedrals that gave them the clue that it was talking about male and female. Like during the Middle Ages and like in medieval alchemy and so on, like Renaissance era alchemy, like those were considered that the moon was considered to be masculine, or the sun was considered to be masculine and the moon was considered to be feminine. So that was a good observation there. So they have this thing in 1908 where they say everything vibrates, and you wouldn't know everything vibrates in 1908. You'd have, you could probably know everything is moving in 1908, but vibration is a particular kind of motion. It's oscillatory motion, like a sine wave, right? And the closest we would get would be Maxwell's laws, where you have electromagnetism going on. Electromagnetic waves are light and so on, and that moves via vibration, but you wouldn't know that random particles move by vibration. Now, it's kind of funny because Kako even said in that clip I had that before 1926 we had no idea everything vibrated. We knew things were moving, but we would have no idea that everything was vibrating, and yet, well, the Kybalion says everything is vibrating. So now you might say, well, that's just they got lucky, right? That prima facie, that would be probably your best explanation is, they happen to get lucky by saying everything vibrates. We didn't actually know it, but they kind of guessed it. They're like, okay, but the other people are doing it from the scientific method. These guys were just kind of hack occultists or whatever. They were just kind of guessing this. It's just a guess, and they got lucky. However, they go further into this, and they're like, well, you parse the statements apart, and they make this very good case in this whole chapter on this in the Quantum Hermetica. They parse the statements apart, and it becomes very clear very quickly that it's not just a random guess. I mean, by itself, that's a random guess, but they say other things about vibration in there. And it becomes very clear the only thing that could possibly fit the description is a wave function. For example, Now, here's this next part. Okay, so they talk about, the Hermetic teachings go even further than do those of modern science. They teach that all manifestation of thought, emotion, reason, will, or desire, or any mental state or condition are accompanied by vibrations, a portion of which are thrown off and which tend to affect the minds of other persons by induction. This is the principle which produces the phenomena of telepathy, mental influence, and other forms of the action and power of mind over mind. Now, that's not me saying it. That's the Quantum Hermetica quoting the Kabbalion. And, jury's out on the telepathy thing. But the point is you don't have to like take telepathy literally. Like say is, a skeptic or something doesn't believe that is a real thing. Don't take it literally. Just treat it as like a hypothetical for a moment, right? Let's say it hypothetically were to exist. Now, how would you explain it? And if you were to explain it with vibration, how would you what in science, in nature, would actually be possible to explain telepathy if it were a real thing? What do you think, Tom?
It's something that I get into. It's called PSI. Are you familiar with PSI?
Psi, yes. No, but I'm saying, what is the mechanism for psi?
Oh,
what would be the mechanism?
Mind. It would be mind.
Well, what piece of physics, though, would explain it, do you think?
Oh, quantum mechanics.
Okay. Specifically?
I'm not sure. Oh, maybe the wave or the double slit experiment.
Well, quantum entanglement, right?
Yeah, quantum entanglement. Yeah.
You have two particles. They're at vast distance. You change one.
Yep.
The other one takes on the exact opposite state at the same moment, with no link between them, no apparent link between them, or no link inside space-time between them. So there is this weird thing where you'd have two minds entangled, and they would, and of course people would say, well, no, you can't transmit information with entanglement. Well, that's true. Classical information you can't transmit. Quantum information is already transmitted by definition. But the point is that that's not really a problem when you understand like how the model would treat it, because you would, number one, it's not violating relativity because it's not happening in space-time. Number two, if the minds are quantum mechanical in the first place, you don't need to transmit classical information. You just have to have the two minds have the information, the quantum information that they already have, and then have them entangled somehow, right?
Right.
So what's weird, though, is you listen to this and you say, well, think about this for a second, okay? If you have vibrations that are being thrown off and then other people picking them up, and that's telepathy, right? Well, compare that to imagine if those are classical vibrations for a second. Say, you ever go through a big country drive?
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
You ever listen to the radio while you're going?
Yeah, it gets fuzzy. It goes in and out. Yeah.
So after a few hundred miles, what happens usually?
It completely goes out. Yeah.
And then you have to change the station. You find new signals coming in, right?
Right.
Okay, and those are broadcast towers that are made to send signals out a long ways, right?
Yeah.
Your brain's not built like that at all. It's like a quarter hertz. It's not going to go, and then it's surrounded by your skull and your skin and so on. It's not going to transmit hardly anything.
Right.
It's not built as a transmitter, so it's not going to pick anything up like that. And much less, you hear telepathy stories of telepathy. Sometimes they're like, someone said, I was talking to my friend on the other side of the world, and I heard things right away, right? There's like those are the stories of telepathy. It happens over like vast thousands of miles. It's not something it's not classical. If that is a real phenomenon, it's nothing classical that's mediating that.
Right.
And so you have and much less out of brains, which are not even built like, radio transmitters.
Right.
So what they're describing here, but they have these vibrations that they're describing as vibrations mediating it. Well, the definition of entanglement in quantum mechanics is two or more particles sharing the same wave function, aka vibration. Right. Doki Doki, how many dimensions are out there? As far as we know, 10. That's from superstring theory.
Wow, I didn't even know that.
Yep. Well, it'd be 11 technically because there's a time dimension as well. So 10 space plus 1 time. 10 plus 1 dimensions, I like to say. Yeah, so it's weird because the only thing that could possibly be explaining this is entanglement. I mean, a vibration mediating this action at a distance, but then well, that's weird. That fits one thing and only one thing, and it fits it very precisely, and that sounds like entanglement, right?
Yeah, that sounds like entanglement to me. Yeah.
No, the question though is well, how do you? This was written in 1908. And quantum entanglement was first hypothesized in 1935 because Einstein didn't like quantum mechanics, and he goes together with Podolsky and Rosen. He's like, "We got to write a paper on this, guys, and we can show that if quantum mechanics is real, we should have this spooky action at a distance, which is going to look like, a voodoo doll effect, and obviously that's ridiculous, and we can't have that in physics. So obviously, therefore, quantum mechanics is somehow incomplete, right?" And so that was his argument. So, and then they find they finally do the Bell inequality test in 1981. They're like, "Oh, no, there is entanglement, and it's actually a real thing in physics." And so you couldn't even conceive of what they're describing in 1908 until 1935. That's 27 years later.
Yeah.
How did that get in there?
I don't know. That's a great question.
That's spooky, isn't it? I mean, the first one you could say...
That is spooky.
So I'm kind of agnostic about this, Blessed Bible Fight Club. They actually get into some of this in the book, though. You might want to look the book up online, the Quantum Hermetica, and they have a couple of examples of this. And there was another book that a friend gave me a while back. He loaned me a while back. Dean Radin's Real Magic. And he goes into a whole bunch of psi experiments. And a lot of these are controversial, but he appears anyway. I'm going to say appears. I'm not going to say for certain, but it appears that he presents some fairly high sigma tests of psi. Sigma being, standard deviance.
Yeah, so I've done my investigation of this. I think it's a whole field. It's called PSI, doing the paranormal, or I think I'm trying to get the official
parapsychology.
Yeah, parapsychology. Yeah, and they have thousands of papers of this actually being true. And it all comes down to, again, like idealism, because mind is fundamental, like with these other demonic minds and all these other sorts of entities, like that's always has some type of mental ontology to it. And even think about Jesus in the New Testament when he's walking on water, peering through doors, all that stuff to me is linked to or corresponds to quantum mechanics somehow. Would you agree with that? Like with Jesus?
Yeah, well, actually, any miracle by definition would need to be. This is a little funny thing has to do with the universe. Actually, we're going to get to the universal wave function in just a minute anyway, on a completely different note. But the universal wave function is outside of time. That's part of one of its properties, and they tested that property in 2013. So time emerges from the universal wave function. Now, what that means, though, is, well, when you think of causality, right, cause and effect, that is also inside of time, right? So if time emerges from the universal wave function, everything that is causal has to emerge from it as well, because causality is within time, right? It's a chain of events in time, correct?
Correct.
So, well, you think of a miracle, well, that's a supernatural agent, or what you call a supernatural agent. I mean, the definition of that kind of blurs away here, but causing some kind of physical effect, right? That's still cause and effect. So whatever miracles there are would have to be baked into the universal wave function by definition.
Yeah.
So automatically it's in quantum mechanics.
So, like,
the time emerges from it. So any events in time emerge from it too.
Are you saying God is the universal wave function, or the mind of God?
That's one possibility. I'm kind of open on that. The Quantum Hermetica book seems to kind of just equate God with the universal wave function, but doesn't go further. That's actually kind of an open philosophical question. I would say, at the very least, though, that the universal wave function is at the very least the lower bound of God's mind. I don't know what's beyond that. If there is anything beyond that, then it would be something that wouldn't be causally related to us anyway.
Now, there's people like Sean Carroll, other types of atheists out there. They say there's quantum fields, and I mean, do you think there is such a thing as called quantum fields? And is that immaterial? Like, that would be mine, right?
Yeah. Well, so the thing with that is the quantum field is simply the wave function. Like, they think about the 0-point field. The 0-point field simply is the universal wave function projected out spatially. So when you think of a wave function, it's going to be mapped across like the x-axis, right, or the x, y, or z axis. That's a spatial thing. Whereas that the wave function actually isn't in space, and it can't be, because it would violate relativity if it did. That's because of the whole entanglement thing. But you still have a way of taking these quantum states and mapping them out onto kind of a spatial grid, right? You're projecting this into space. You're projecting a quantum state into space-time, right? And so when it's projected, you have to map it out as though it were in space, even though it's not really in space. And so that mapping out, that approximation of this quantum state as quote unquote existing in space is what we think of as the quantum field.
Okay.
So yeah, there's a reality to that.
So, like, does that denote some type of multiverse then? So, you think that is plausible?
That's an interesting question. I've kind of gone back and forth on this. There are some problems with how to make the multiverse work in terms of how to make certain predictions in quantum mechanics, and yet at the same time, when you think about, like, say, quantum superposition, like, say a quantum computer, right? It uses a bit, right? Okay,
right.
A qubit, which is a superposition of many ones and zeros at once. Well, the quantum computer works, and it works much faster than the classical computer because it's exploiting these superpositions, right? So these superpositions are very real things. These states of superposition are very real things because otherwise the quantum computer wouldn't work, and we've got, some very powerful quantum computers right now. Right. It's still in its infancy, but, we have that as a thing. And so when you have that, obviously there is some kind of ontological reality to those other states in superposition, right?
Right.
And so the question is, well, those might, if you take that as literal, then they would have to be these other universes because they exist just the same way as we exist. The cat here is alive, and yet in some other universe the cat is dead, or in another state the wave function of the cat is dead. And so, well, the state where the cat is dead, that's a reality. It has some kind of ontological reality that's affecting our superposition. So, yeah, in that sense, you have to say it's real. Now, of course, the issue is, and this is kind of funny, materials like to say this preserves realism, therefore we get materialism back out of quantum mechanics. Well, there's something in the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics called the preferred basis problem. And that is, if everyone is a classical state, then no one should be in superposition. And therefore, we shouldn't even be aware of a superposition in the first place, right? So in this universe, the cat is alive. This one is dead. And this one it's dying or just survived or something. And all these are different, possibilities in the wave function, right? But if none of them are being affected by any other universes, they're all collapsed classical states, then none of them should be quantum states. None of them should have any kind of influence on other universes, in which case there's no reason to believe those other universes exist, and there's no reason to believe in quantum mechanics either, because then, the whole point of quantum mechanics is it's one of the things about it is the superposition principle, right?
Right.
So trying to sort out why it should be classical in some cases versus quantum in some other cases, and how these should be, which one of these two should be the preferred basis, as it were, for the state in your universe. This is called the preferred basis problem. And it turns out recently there was a solution to this problem. Okay, so it's good for the materialists, right? And Sean Carroll even... if someone out there has a clip to this, it would be very helpful. Gunter Beckley from the Discovery Institute gave me a link of Sean Carroll giving a talk on this. And then it was taken down due to copyright. The talk was taken down due to copyright.
Oh, my gosh.
Yeah, it's totally irritating, right? It's like there's one clip. Yeah. I want to get this one. This clip would be gold if I could find it, but the thing's been taken down. So if anyone out there can find Sean Carroll talking about the preferred basis problem and how it's solved, send that to me, because I would like to find that. Just go to my channel, same as my name, on YouTube. Anyway, long story short is they found a way to solve the preferred basis problem. So good for materialists, right?
Yeah.
Well, there's a little catch. The solution works all right. The problem is the solution needs emergent space-time to work.
Oh, okay, yeah, that's a big catch. Yep.
They just blew it. It'll work, but it's not going to work for materialism anymore, which is funny because that is... When you think of quantum mechanics interpretation, you can say we just go for some other interpretation. Well, not really. Everyone likes to say that, quantum mechanics, you can't really say because there's all these different interpretations. And that's not really true. There are other interpretations, yes. The problem is that when you look at the interpretations up close, not all interpretations are created equal. Some interpretations are what I call theory motivated versus other ones that are speculative, okay? And the theory motivated ones would be anything on the Copenhagen branch, which is kind of the idealism branch. It would also be MWI and MMI, which is kind of the hybrid of the Copenhagen approach with the many worlds approach. And then things like the transactional interpretation, which transactional involves time travel, which would by definition entail a multiverse, which then it would have the same preferred basis problem then as, MWI, because it kind of implies the same kind of thing, right? So those are theory-motivated approaches, okay? Versus speculative is you're saying we have this theory and we're going to try and explain it with some other types of things. We're going to add some doodads to the model. So like Bohmian mechanics or objective collapse models. And when you look at those up close, you discover that they become very quickly, very horribly ad hoc to the point where, like, you could say, one of these things, I was talking to Tim Maudlin the other day, and he was kind of unhappy with me. And so I was saying his model was crackpot. But, he has this thing where I say, well, look at this article, right? And it says, points out Bohmian mechanics is falsified because, if there's independent particles on top of waves, those waves are going to not quantum tunnel through anything. You can have a wave, a water wave in a bathtub, and it's going to convert into a mechanical wave in the wall, but the rubber ducky floating on top is not going to float through the wall, right?
Right.
And so you just saw that with the guidance equation, he said, and I didn't know what that was at first. It looked kind of stupid, but I later looked that up, and I'm like, oh, I knew immediately what was wrong with it at that point, right? Is that the guy, what he's trying to do with his guidance, he has this fancy, mathematical sounding language here to simply say, we're going to come up with a random equation that violates simple electrostatic repulsion. And we're going to say it's okay to violate simple electrostatic repulsion by simply saying we're going to model that with an equation. I'm like, well, no, dude, you can't do that. You have to explain why the electron is not repelling the other electron.
Right.
Like you can't just change the physics around willy-nilly like that and say it's okay because you have math for it. Like you can have math for all kinds of. You can have math for, Russell's teapot in orbit around Mars. It doesn't mean it's there. So yeah, these models become very ridiculously ad hoc very quickly, and to the point where you can't even falsify it. Like that was considered to be a falsification, and yet he says, well, no, we're not falsifying. It just means you change the math again. Like that's not the same theory anymore. And as Popper pointed out, you can have a bunch of dots on a paper, right? And like those are data points, and you can then link any number of possible graphs through those. Any number of possible lines can be used to link those points up. And at that point, science becomes impossible because you can't tell the difference between a true theory versus a false theory anymore, because you can just simply, what gets falsified, we'll just find a different way of, rearranging the line. The line can become infinitely ad hoc or infinitely complex, and at that point, you're not making sense of data anymore. It's just a mess now. All you have is observations with no theory to put them together. So the speculative approaches, they have these serious problems, and they're very obviously not true, because they're adding all this extra ad hoc gibberish, and that doesn't make sense, and it would have other problems like contributing to increased thermodynamic heat capacity, which we don't see if they were real. And so, it's going to be in the theory-motivated approach. And the thing with that is you got the Copenhagen branch and you got the Everett branch. And I'm going to kind of include transactional in there because it implicitly implies a multiverse, even though I'm not explicitly saying it. And so the Copenhagen branch is already idealist, whereas the Everett branch still needs emergent spacetime to solve its preferred basis problem, right? But you can't have emergent spacetime with materialism. So quantum mechanics, doesn't matter which approach you take now. And they used to say they're going to go to MWI as their safe house, right? They can't do that anymore because now both branches get rid of matter fundamentally.
Oh,
either by going straight idealism or by saying spacetime is emergent, which kind of implies idealism but doesn't say it outright.
Right. So like I think what I'm getting out of this too is like the fundamental aspect of reality is you could be quantified in mathematical terms as like everything around us except ourselves. I would say the only thing that's not, we could be described as mathematical terms, is ourselves, because we're the ones who shape and form the wave function.
We are the wave. Our minds are the wave function. That's the thing. Like it is. Okay. That's the whole quantum cognition thing. That's what they were. That's part of the quantum idealism model. Mind is wave function.
Would you say everything outside of ourselves is described in mathematical terms? Yeah. Like even a metaverse, a multiverse, would that change? What if could that change or?
No, that's probably, that's just ubiquitous to physics. So like that's just the fact that everything can be explained by physics is that they'll just fit that because physics, the language of physics is mathematics.
Yes. And I don't know about you, but the way I look at mathematics, well, I think that's a sort of a description of mind anyway. Like I don't see how you could look at that. I don't see how that could be quantified in a physical sense or material sense, or
But it's
in that type
quantified, but
of.
it's not in a material sense. That's the whole point here is that you have a metaphysical system that instantiates Temple's dilemma. So it's inside of
Right.
physical. It's inside of the laws of physics, like scientific laws, but those scientific laws are being applied to something that is not material. It's fundamentally mental. And so it's the common dichotomy is there's material and scientific on one side, and supernatural and outside of science and mental on the other side. And what's being said here is, no, it's all natural laws, but those natural laws are being applied to something that is non-material, and the only thing that exists is non-material.
Okay, that makes the way you
Yeah, so
explained it
it's
makes.
kind of a third option in the tape in the deck there.
So, Blessed Bible Club. Well, he gets like a determined reality out of that, but I don't think so. I don't.
Not necessarily, because one of the fundamental laws, and the whole point of quantum mechanics, for example, is probability, quantum probability.
Right.
And actually, it's kind of cool because Hoffman actually believes that the whole uncertainty in the quantum uncertainty principle, Heisenberg uncertainty principle, is actually a third-person account of little conscious agents making free will decisions.
Wow, that's incredible. I never knew
Which
that.
actually makes sense, because when you think of quantum cognition, the whole point of quantum cognition is your mind is being modeled with, like, what's your favorite ice cream, for example?
I would say Rocky Road.
And what's your second favorite?
Um, Probably some type of Oreo type of ice cream.
Okay, so you go to the freezer and you see Rocky Road and your Oreo ice cream, right?
Yeah,
Or Cookie Crunch or something like that.
a
I don't
Cookie
know.
Crunch. Yeah,
Yeah,
something like that.
Rocky Road and Cookie Crunch, right? And you thinking I'm gonna go for Rocky Road, and you're like, no, I'm gonna go for Cookie Crunch. And you kind of go back and forth, and you
Yeah,
finally pick one or the other, maybe even both out, and that's it, right? Now, if you're the Terminator, like a classical computer, you're going to compute the quote unquote right decision immediately. You may even have a randomizer program, but fundamentally, it's still going to be, you know, classical computation, and you're going to pick one out and you're going to shut the door immediately, and that's going to be it, right?
right.
But it never happens like that. You pause at the door and you're like, you hesitate and vacillate between the two, and you finally pick one or the
Right.
other. And this effect is ubiquitous to all human decision making, and it also obeys the Schrodinger equation of all things, which is why the guess is that's where one of the first hints was that the mind is actually being modeled. It may actually be a wave function. So that's you doing a free will decision as a wave function from the first person. And that vacillation between Rocky Road and and Cookie Crunch is actually those are two superpositions in your mind's wave function, and you are your mind is a wave function. You're picking one or the other, and you're vacillating between them. And the free will decision is the random quantum probabilistic event of which one you decide to pick.
And I would say that also quantum mechanics, I don't know if you can maybe verify this, but it seems to me that the human observer at least has choice power, or at least has some type of influence of how the subatomic particles react and behave. So in that sense, if they have some type of autonomy over that, then and wouldn't that qualify as some type of free will? Because that's how we would, at least as far as in a physical sense, at least we have some type of choice power over our reality around us. Maybe not with God. I guess you could be a Calvinist and still yet believe in some type of free will.
Right.
Yeah, like have you heard of like a retrocausality? Would that have something to do with with the free will aspect, or no?
Well, it could set the past up in such a way that it matched your free will decision.
Okay.
The past renders the same way the space, the time isn't real the same way the space isn't real. So it was a retcon, as it were, you might say. So
okay.
So let's continue with the whole vibration parallels, because they were really fascinating, actually. Let me see where this was in the.
I was seeing one of the main Hermetic principles is one of them that it catches my eye is the all is mind and the universe is mental. That's
That's
incredible.
idealism. Yeah, that's idealism.
Yeah,
But now the thing with this is, which I think I mentioned this before, about the whole. Was this in the pre-show? I mentioned this. I think I mentioned this in the pre-show. When you look at this Hermetic system, what's very curious about this is there's this principle of mentalism, which is idealism, and there's this principle of vibration, right? And you think, well, these two don't even how are these even related to each other? They're just kind of thrown together in this ad hoc fashion. Why is one connected to the other, right? And what you discover is, well, if you're in a dream, right? A mental universe is like a dream, right? Everything could be moving. It could be, it could be in oscillatory, vibratory motion, but it could also be just frozen in place, and it could also be in kinetic motion, right? Or it could be in some mix of all three of the above, right? There's no way to specify one versus the other there, right?
right.
I mean, it doesn't seem to. And so, therefore, when you link vibration with this, it doesn't even seem to make sense. It's like, well,
No.
that's just one possibility. It has no connection to idealism per se or mentalism per se. But then you realize you go to this whole emergent space-time approach, right? And they're saying in quantum gravity now that space-time emerges from quantum entanglement. But then you go over to things like quantum cognition or Hoffman's conscious realism or integrated information theory, and they're now equating consciousness with entanglement, which is a vibration, right?
Right.
So you put that back into emergent space-time of entanglement, and you get a model of idealism all of a sudden, right?
Yeah, I would say so, yeah.
So now suddenly idealism does become directly linked to vibration because it's, that's the wave function. That's the wave function that's causing the entanglement.
Right? Okay, I see. I think I know where you're going.
But wait a minute. Now there's a non-ad hoc link. But the problem with this is, in order to understand that non-ad hoc link, you'd first need to identify consciousness with entanglement, and you'd also have to identify space-time as having emerged from a quantum entanglement, right?
Right.
Well, we only discovered that space-time emerges from quantum entanglement. They kind of guessed it a little before this, about 9 years ago, maybe 10 years ago. But they really solidified it about 5 years ago. They had this DS mirror correspondence. Okay, so this became solid knowledge 4 or 5 years ago, right? Now, when you look back at this Kabbalah thing, right, you see how this vibration got mixed up with mentalism. The only way to link those two is to have physics that we only discovered in the last 5 years.
Wow.
So how did it end up in a book in 1908?
That's beyond my mind. Yeah.
That's spooky, isn't it?
That's very spooky. Yeah.
Then when you compare and you add in the fact that they just predicted entanglement, and there's a bunch of other stuff they predicted as well. There's the thing with the universal wave function, for example. They have this thing where they say, okay, so the universal wave function, you think of it, the closest, they call it the all in Hermeticism, okay? Well, you think of what is the all, right? And you think, well, the all is this, the closest thing you think of is this universal wave function, right? Not only this, but even the all in itself manifests a constant vibration of an infinite degree of intensity and rapid motion that may be practically considered as at rest. It seems to be kind of conflicting statements there, but the one is simply kind of a commonsensical assumption of what happens when you keep adding vibrations together. But then the last statement is weird, though. It may be practically considered as at rest. Well, who would have thought that would be practically considered as at rest, right?
Right.
Well, turns out in 1967, you find that there's this thing called the Wheeler-DeWitt equation. And the calculation, they discovered that the universal wave function has zero energy in it, total. And so when you have zero energy in the universal wave function, well, that has a zero K value in the Schrödinger equation. That's the frequency, which means a zero vibratory rate. It's frozen in time. So the universal wave function is at rest. And yet they somehow get the all's vibration is at rest. Wait, what? How did that happen? That's 59 years away. That's a 59-year departure.
That's fascinating how they would get that. Yeah, that to me blows my mind. Wow.
Yeah, let's look at another one that was fascinating here. So they had this. Let's read this one here. This was kind of cool too. This is one of the ones I put in the Kabbalah's vibration enigma. The universal ether, which is postulated by science without its nature being understood clearly, is held by the Hermeticists to be but a higher manifestation of that which is erroneously called matter. That is to say, matter at a higher degree of vibration, and is called by them the ethereal substance. So what they're saying here is that matter and space-time are two sides of the same thing, right? Or you call it ether. The word ether is being used because it's a 19th century language, because it's just turn of the century. They just discovered Einstein at the time, and they didn't really come to terms that the ether was not what it appears to be. But the equivalent to an ether today in today's language would be space-time. So you translate it into modern 20th century language, and you see what's going on here is, matter and space-time are two sides of the same thing, and the space-time itself has a vibration. Well, then you go in and you find out, it was 2004, 2015, they have these things they're describing space-time as a network of entanglement. Topologically, they call it a string net liquid, okay, which is it's a very large. A string net liquid is it's topologically ordered, which means that there is large-scale entanglement. So not instead of just two particles being entangled, it's large systems of things being entangled together, and space-time is built out of that. Which means that space-time has a vibration. It's an entangled field with its vibration, and then they further showed that different excitations of that field will give rise to W and Z particles as well as other particles. Oh, here we go. This is from New Scientist. They also found that string net theory naturally gave rise to the other elementary particles, such as quarks, which makes up protons and neutrons, and the particles responsible for some of the fundamental forces, such as gluons and the W and Z bosons. Those are all entangled, and those are all different vibrations that are basically you're exciting this space-time, this string net liquid that's comprising space-time, and different excitations in that are different modes of vibration in that are identical to these particles.
Wow, that's
that's the same thing as what's being described here again. And that's not just that's just the general. That's a very specific statement. Like the only way they didn't even know what the constituents of matter were in 1908.
No way.
You have to have particle accelerators to figure that out. You have to you have to have quantum theory has to be developed to a degree, has to begin to be applied to individual forces of matter, and those give rise to particle predictions. And you need to have these big fancy particle accelerators with there's Fermilab down in Chicago. It's like 4 miles around, and there's CERN out in Switzerland.
Yeah.
To make that work, you need to have very large particle accelerators, and you have to smash particles up just to figure out what those particles are. Those particles exist, and then you now have this model where you have to then further build on that this model of testing these particles' properties, and then studying these particles' properties. You can then build this theory, and you have this. You finally come to the realization that there are excitations in this fundamental level of space-time, which is associated vibration to it.
Yes. Wow.
They could not possibly have known that in 1908. They didn't have the technology for it, much less the theory or the science for it. Like you have to have technology to get to a certain level of scientific achievement. You can, you have to run experiments and so on. So they didn't have any of the means to get that, and yet they have that in this statement in this book from 1908, which they then say is not even the original. It's coming back. They say it comes from like way back when.
So, is this leading to like an extraterrestrial type of?
Well, I don't like that. That's one of those things that you touch that topic, your career electrocuted, and I'm just like, I would prefer to personally be agnostic about this.
Right.
Like just simply say, there are certain things you don't want to comment on because if you comment on them, you're like, that's crazy. We're not going to respect your views anymore. So I'm going to say, well, we don't know exactly, but I can say what the authors said. Okay, so this is not me saying it. This is what the authors said. Okay. They go into this whole thing towards the end, and they're saying, well, is it just mysticism, right? Well, you can guess mysticism. You can kind of guess idealism out of mysticism. Well, sure, but the problem is that they have these very specific statements as well, and you don't get specific statements out of mysticism. You kind of get the opposite of specific statements out of mysticism, right?
Right.
I mean, you don't know those things from very specific physics statements out of just mysticism. Those two don't kind of go together too well. So then they say, well, ancient Egypt. I mean, the Kabbalions said they get this stuff from ancient Egypt. They get it from Hermes, who is the Egyptian god Thoth. And the idea was it was kind of transmitted to Egypt through the mystery schools, which then, Pythagoras and people like that went to Egypt to study. They came back to Greece, and then it gets, kind of injected into Western civilization that way, right? So, well, you look at ancient Egypt, and they had some pretty advanced stuff there, right? But the problem is they don't have. If you have something like this looks like pieces of a grand unified theory, right? I mean, when you talk about space-time being emerging, and then you explaining matter with that, that's part of the framework for a grand unified theory.
Right.
That's quantum gravity. That's our emergent space-time from entanglement is currently our most. I mean, we have other things that are speculative, but in terms of things that we think we know for certain, emergent space-time from entanglement is, to my knowledge, our most advanced piece of physics to date. Yes. And that is implied by this Hermetic stuff, right? So in order to get that, you have to have, you would expect with that, you would have other pieces of science as well. You'd have chemistry, you'd have, genetics or microbiology or things like this. You'd have at least a science to put a particle accelerator together, right? The Egyptians don't have that. You know what I'm saying? No. They're advanced, don't get me wrong, but they don't have that kind of advancement. They don't have modern advancement. They don't have electricity, or, I mean, some people will say they don't have electricity on a large scale. They don't have a power grid, right?
Right.
And they certainly don't have, and they had some pretty good surgery techniques, but they weren't aware of genetics and microbiology, okay? And you would expect that a civilization that develops that kind of knowledge, you would expect having that. So they say, well, ancient Egypt, it's probably not ancient Egypt, it's probably, it's as much a relic in their time as it is in our time. Like, we asked the question, how the heck did we get this, right? Well, they said, well, they got it from Egypt. Well, the Egyptians they would be asking the same question. It doesn't fit, right?
Right.
So yeah, it doesn't fit there. It's a very strange, mysterious thing. And yeah, so the thing with that then is well, where did it come from? You look into it, kind of dig in, and you find out Manetho, who is an Egyptian historian in the 3rd century BC. He actually stated in, okay, what are your thoughts on spirits and the ability to join in with a person? Well, that's actually quite possible with the physics. I mean, you just entangle with a person, a vibration match, and the two are, entanglement match. And that's possible.
Yeah. Jesus is talking about people that are possessed and stuff. And
even Hoffman was talking about the possibility that you could have, if reality is made of conscious agents, you could have some conscious agents out there that you wouldn't even see. You see as part of the environment. You wouldn't see them as a being or whatever, and the stuff behind space-time and so on. And you could have these icon interfaces, he calls them. He had this in a talk he had, or is an interview he was on, and he was like saying, you could have some icon interfaces being opened up with some, different types of conscious agents, and some of those conscious agents might not be so friendly, as it were, and so you got to be careful.
Oh, wow.
Yeah,
even Donald Hoffman is getting into this stuff. Man, he's incredible.
Exactly. Some of those conscious agents might not be too friendly. You got to be careful with that. Okay, so this is what Manetho said. Okay, remember, Manetho is we're talking about ancient historians. They're not the same standard as of our historians. Yet at the same time, they are considered accredited historians of their day. These are the closest thing you're going to get to an actual historical authority around the 3rd century BC. Okay, this is like, Herodotus or Manetho are like these are your go-to historians if you want to have something that's considered to be authoritative, reasonably authoritative, around that time. So this is what he said, okay? After the Great Flood, the hieroglyphic texts written by Thoth were translated from the sacred language into Greek and deposited in books in the sanctuaries of Egyptian temples. Now, that's about the origins of Hermeticism. Now, what's weird about this is, number one, he's saying, well, after the Great Flood, right? Which means that Thoth is storing this from before the Great Flood, right?
Right.
Okay, now guess how far back he says the Great Flood was. Because it sounds like Noah's flood, right? But guess how far back he says that this flood happened.
20,000 years.
9,000 years before Manetho. This is what he says. This is 9,000 years before his time, which would mean this would be around 9,300 BC, maybe a little, give or take a couple centuries. That's about 11,500 years ago.
Yeah.
That's crazy. Now, what's cool is you look into geology and you find that's meltwater pulse 1b. They have a name for this. It's the catastrophic rise event 2. Same thing. It's right at the end of the Younger Dryas. There's this big meltdown, and it was a big cataclysmic meltdown, and it caused a lot of damage, and the sea level rose around like 100 feet or something like this, and would have, it was. I mean, it would account as a quote great flood. And so it's funny because he has this recorded, and he says, "Well, this Hermetic stuff comes from before then."
Oh my gosh!
Now that's not me saying that. That's Manetho saying it. So we're kind of piecing the puzzle together, right? And that's what's being described here. So I'm not saying any of these as my claims. I'm saying this is what the given historian, the given stuff that we have on the table. This is what's being said about this. Okay, and this is you got a problem with this, talk to Manetho. Don't talk to me, because I mean this is just what I'm just reading what the history book says.
Right.
This is his quote here. So so Manetho says this is from basically 93. This is at the end of the Pleistocene. This is
wow.
Like
that is mind-boggling.
Tigers. What?
That is mind-boggling.
But how do you get so? And I remember they saying, well, it doesn't come from Egypt. Well, it doesn't really matter because remember that thing I said about the whole triptych temple civilization? It's the same cultural source that's propagating two parts of a puzzle, and you can see a lot of the same principles show up in both systems. And it is Hermetics being discussed because Hermetics is what is encoded in those triptych temple designs, right?
Yeah.
So, this comes from very far back, apparently. I mean, that's the last time that we had access to the, before, Columbus and so on, right? The Vikings, they went to the New World. Hold on, let's look at this question. What are Johann's thoughts on Rosicrucianism, and is he familiar with Max Heindel? I do not know about Max Heindel. Rosicrucianism, I thought it was kind of interesting. I mean, it supposedly was an idea to kind of mix, trying to explain Christianity with like a Hermetic framework. Like it was trying to it sounds kind of interesting because the Hermetic seems to be valid metaphysics. And you're trying to combine it with, Christian theology, right? So it sounds like a good idea. The trouble is that it's a secret society, and with all secret societies have a tendency to become very easily, corrupted. I mean, the whole point is they're not transparent, right? So you have, in an open democracy, you can see what the president is doing, and supposing that there's not secret deals being made behind the scenes. But you can always, you're going to have media to, at least when media nowadays doesn't do this, but if it is functioning the way that it should be functioning and not the way that it currently is functioning, they can expose things that happen, right? So the thing with that is you can always see it. You can find it. You at least have a chance of finding and uprooting a corrupt politician in a democracy. A secret society, you don't even know what levels are above you. Sometimes they have like secret societies within secret societies, and then you have, you just have to have one bad apple get to the top level, and then your whole secret society is screwed because there's no transparency. You don't know what's going on at the next level. See, if there's corruption that gets up there, you can't figure it out. And so, then we see, maybe Rosicrucianism was a good idea when it first started, but then you see, 400 years later, you see the initials RC Christian, a clear reference to Rosicrucianism, showing up on the Georgia Guidestones, which have some very, kind of Orwellian. I mean, they address it in really nice language, but it's suggestions that would, if taken literally, would lead to a very bad kind of situation, So like a typical deep state sort of view of how reality, of how society should run is like, no thanks. Like, I mean, it sounds good on paper, but like with all secret societies, that has a tendency towards corruption. And, given 400 years of time, apparently, assuming RC Christian is referencing Rosicrucianism, then they probably got corrupted just like all the other ones. So.
Yeah, so like
not that you can't learn things from them, but I wouldn't join them.
Yeah, And like, would you say like the pyramids, some of the mathematical or properties that surrounds the pyramids are really interesting, and they have like the perfect coordinates of like certain galaxies or whatever it is. Like, would you say that would comport with hermetics or no?
It might relate to it some way. I don't know offhand though. I mean, it's I mean, hermetics is its own mystery, and it may be that well, it may be that it has some relation to our hypothetical the triptych temple civilization, which would be kind of cool. But it's kind of hard to say because when you're not dealing with history anymore, history starts like about 6,000 years ago, 5,000 years ago, something like that. And
Yeah.
then before that, you're like, well, it's hard to draw connections. I mean, we managed to make the connection between hermetics and the triptych temple civilization because we found that the symbolism was being encoded in it was actually encoding hermetics. So we kind of got lucky there. But in a lot of these cases, it's very difficult to make deductions from things that you don't have history about. So,
Yeah, I think if you want, we can wrap this up too because we've been here about an hour and a half. It's
oh,
up to you.
I should add, so basically what they get to is they kind of, this is the book author saying this. They kind of poke at the whole ancient alien thing, and they say the Watchers in the Book of Enoch might be related to this somehow, and they say that this also show up in other mythologies. Now, what's interesting, I don't know if you know this, the Central Intelligence Agency is actually interested in this research.
That's wow, the CIA. Oh my god.
The CIA is interested in this, and there's if you know this, the whole quantum idealism thing. I'd watched a couple of Tom Campbell's videos, and I'm just from a physics angle, and I knew exactly where he was coming from with this, right? Like he was describing it in a very generic sense of like reality emerges from information and space-time as an illusion. I'm like, I thought that's valid, but now let's put this into and he's a NASA physicist, but he's kind of just giving an overview of the physics. He didn't give like the specifics. And I thought, let's try and make this solid and turn it into a solid scientific model, right? And so what I said was, let's combine, we say reality is an illusion. That's in the physics. Well, sure it is, but what specific physics? And that's when we got to the whole emergent states from entanglement thing, right?
Right.
And then consciousness is information, he says. Well, true, but what in cognitive science says that conscious is information? And then they got to integrated information theory. And so we then plugged the two together, and now we have this very robust model of quantum idealism, which then the Palmers took further, and they said, let's make the next step, and let's compare that to hermetics, right?
Yep.
And they had this really elaborate, they showed a very precise parallel with hermetics. Now, where did Tom Campbell get it from? And if you know this, Tom Campbell was hired by the Monroe Institute, which was an organization. They were into parapsychology and they were into some other stuff like this, but they were actually being funded by at one time. And they're not the same organization. They're not like a subsidiary of the CIA, but the CIA was actually doing funding research with them. And I don't know if you know this. There's a document that's circulating online where they have the CIA has this project on remote viewing. And they have this whole paper was released on a declassified document on remote viewing, and it actually hired the Monroe Institute to work with the paper. The Monroe Institute is directly connected to that paper, so it's funny because this was the result of CIA research, right? When you look at the paper, it was kind of funny. I didn't realize at the time, but Tom Campbell, he got it from CIA research, and I got it from Tom Campbell. And then the Palmers got this from me, and they're like, this is hermetics. Now, when you go back to the original document, now what's very fascinating about this is the original document says this is occult parallels. There's occult parallels, and they want to solidify this and turn this into a more solid science. But they didn't have the full science then. They kind of guessed the universe was a hologram, but they didn't really. I mean, at that point in time, the universe being a hologram was kind of seen as woo, but now we know it's not from Juan Maldacena with the EDS miracle or the not EDS mirror, the EDS CFT correspondence. That's the holographic principle. That was like in the late 90s. And I think the paper was the declassified paper was like in 95 or something like that. It was released then. It was classified before that. So at that point, it was just baby steps, but they already recognized that it has like occult parallels, but they want to turn into solid science. And now what's interesting about this is, so the CIA started this thing off at the Monroe Institute, and they were doing this research into this stuff. And then that paper gets out, and then that was demonstrating the link. And then Tom Campbell gets into this thing at the Monroe Institute, and then I get it from Tom Campbell's lectures. And then next thing you know, we have quantum idealism, right? And then further this quantum hermetics. Now, what's funny is the CIA, if you talk to the news media will say, yes, they did have a paper that was released, declassified from the CIA, and they said, but it didn't work, right? And that's the CIA's conclusion, was that this did not work, supposedly. Well, my friend Trevor says that they did actually work and that they said the other things, so it's like they're speaking out of both sides of their mouth. But now here's the really disturbing part about all this, okay? It turns out that the Palmers, after they started writing this book, they got a death threat. Now, they got a death threat 2 days after they started writing the book, they told me, okay? Now, the creepy thing is we don't know who gave the death threat, but we do have a very good idea of what they were using to give the death threat with, okay? They give the death threat through a friend, and the friend's cell phones were his entire, like entire previous month of cell logs, they told me were deleted remotely. Now, you cannot delete someone, even a computer hacker, you can't just hack into someone's cell phone and delete all the phone logs for an entire month, right? I mean, that's a very difficult thing to do. It is possible, though. There is actually a piece of software that exists that allows someone to hack someone else's cell phone remotely and delete cell phone logs, okay? The problem is that this piece of software is only available to state actors. I think maybe some other people have access to it now, like a Saudi prince had access to this once, I think. But you can't just be like a regular computer hacker and get access to this stuff because it's actually classified spyware. It's a computer program, but it's like, it's like, right. An ordinary person can't just buy a bazooka or a nuke or something like that, right? Like that, right. That's illegal. Yeah. Well, this is like the cyber warfare version of a nuke or a bazooka, okay? And it's called Pegasus. It's the most sophisticated spyware in the world, and then the Israeli government, Israeli intelligence developed it, and then they gave it to the U.S. and so on. And so the point is that whoever gave this death threat would have to have been a state actor, had to be someone like in an intelligence organization, because you can't get access to Pegasus unless you're not in an intelligence organization.
Yeah.
So what's spooky here is on the one side they're saying, well, this hermetics thing it's all, and not just that, but the whole thing with the Monroe Institute paper, it's all fake, right? Like, it's real. We did research into it, but we found that there was nothing there, supposedly, right? But then you have someone who is apparently in an intelligence agency, because that's the only people who are able to have access to Pegasus, delivering a death threat, using Pegasus to deliver a death threat to try and not get the quantum hermetica written.
Wow, that's just...
Why don't you give a death threat over something that doesn't work or something that is just right. Blue? And why? And number one, maybe a random person doing a death threat. I mean, that's okay because it's not okay that someone got a death threat, but it could just be some crazy person giving a death threat. But crazy people do not have access to Pegasus software.
Wow,
that's intelligence organizations.
There seems to be some deep implications with this hermetic stuff.
Yeah, I mean, what it tells me is that, maybe it did actually work, and maybe they didn't want this reason. So this book is something that the CIA does not want out. There's someone with Pegasus spyware made a concerted effort to give a death threat to prevent this particular book from getting out. So make sure you go get this book and spread it around. It's the Quantum Hermetica. You can find it on Amazon. It's like $15. It's really cheap, and it's a really fascinating book. But yeah,
I'm gonna get this book and get into a little bit, but it makes me, it raises an eyebrow because it seems like the elites and some other people that are like billionaires and stuff, they want to break through like this dimension of I think they're trying to break through this dimension of reality. Like they already know they can. And like, I think there's some knowledge out there, I think that's related to this that a lot of people have. And so, I mean, would you agree with that? Or do you think that's more like a conspiracy?
It's possible that that it's just, well, it's not, we know part of this. I mean, whether or not it works could be a conspiracy theory, but we do know for a fact that they gave a death threat, and then whoever gave the death threat was using Pegasus spyware.
Right.
Or invented a spyware that had the exact same functions as Pegasus, but I mean, you have to be a very top-notch computer hacker to write something like that, and in which case you might as well have Pegasus in the first place.
Wow.
So yeah, it's. I mean,
that is telling. That is telling.
We're pretty certain that it was some intelligence agency person gave a death threat to prevent this research from coming out.
So I mean, yeah. So I think especially with you, I mean, like with your understanding of physics and stuff, I wonder if even you're like now in in jeopardy or I hope not. I
Well,
hope
they
that
they
you don't.
kind of imply that there was like, I mean, I haven't really done much with it, so I like at the moment, so I'm like, but they kind of implied that they were aware that I was doing quantum idealism and didn't really want that either. They weren't
Yeah.
too happy about that, but yeah. So yeah. And then what's kind of crazy though is that we've lost contact with the Palmers. We haven't been able to get to them in months. Well,
Oh
where's
man.
the evidence of the death threat? Well, I mean, I suppose you have my word. I spoke to them about this, right? So I mean, making it up or something, they could be making it up, but I mean, I don't see any reason they would be making it up. So
Yeah.
that's kind of obvious, I think.
Incredible stuff. I want people to get that book and check it out. I had one last question. If so, like you were mentioning that through this wave function, that time is part of this wave function. Now, does that seem to me like I hate to use the word coming? Would you associate with like being created? Like, is time fundamental even outside of this illusion or this reality that we think that we're in right now, or is time simulated, in other words, or
You wouldn't be because simulation is in time, but it would still be simulated in a kind of generic sense in that it's like it's a construct. It's, you
okay.
might say emanated might be a better way of describing it. It's a construct of something deeper.
Okay. So like there's some people that say that nature is part of the mind of God, or it's part of God, part of his nature. Would you say that, or would you say not necessarily?
That was part of God's nature.
Yeah, time, like, would, because aren't you like a B theorist on that too?
I'm a B
Like,
theorist. Yeah, that's just physics. B theory is physics. So no, God is outside time. Time is
oh, okay.
something that's constructed
Yeah,
inside of
that's
God's
what I was
mind.
getting at. Because some people think that God is not outside of time, but we would see the paradox, I guess, that, or the problem, the dilemma that we run into is how can God be outside of time and be in time at the same time? Well, I think idealism would probably resolve that. Do you think so? Or
Say that again.
so, like atheists, like they try to put us into like some type of dilemma, like how can God be outside of time and inside time at the same time? Well, I'm saying like that would be idealism would address that, because we're not saying that there's two realities, like a physical, like a subset, or two, what do you call, like a dualism. So dualism would make it problematic, I think, but idealism, I think, would resolve that problem. Would you agree? Or
Well, it's not only dualism; it's that it makes sense. It's the construct is inside of God's mind. It emerges inside of God's mind.
yeah, so I mean, there's no contradiction of how can God create something inside time and be outside of time, and like it's almost like there's sort of like a what's it, like a contradiction. How can God, like, it's like, I mean, William Lane Craig says, well, like when the bowling ball hits a cushion, like he would say it's simultaneous with like reality when he creates it. But like we wouldn't, I mean, as an idealist, that we're saying this reality is not even fundamental anyway.
Mm-hmm.
Like it's like we don't even need to worry about that contradiction. I guess that's what I'm getting at. Yeah.
I think it's crazy to think that they. Sorry, back with that CIA thing. The fact that they got Pegasus software to try and shut this thing down,
Yeah, that is scary. Yeah.
which makes you wonder what happens if this thing does get pushed around in society. Like if this thing is like pushed out. Like
Yeah.
this thing has to go nuclear. Like I would love to see us go nuclear, just because I hate these deep state fuckers. Pardon my French. And
Yeah.
if the deep state wants to cover something up, we got to make it blow up all over the place.
Yes, absolutely. I get this information around. Here's a question here if you want to.
Everything's well, in a certain sense, everything that's ever happened is recorded. It's in the universal wave function. I mean, time is in the universal wave function, so everything inside of, so in that sense, yeah, everything is recorded in that sense.
Interesting stuff. Wow. This was an enthralling discussion here, Johan. I appreciate you bringing this, imparting some of this to us today. It's I'm even kind of raising my eyebrow into this now. I'm going to look more into this stuff. I appreciate everything and your time, man, and Is there anything else you want to get into, or do you just want to wind it down here?
I think that's about it, actually.
Okay, man. I've been wanting this to happen for a while to get you on, because I think you're one of the best sources out there when it comes to putting it together, as a theist. Because you have some people that have part of it, like they know the quantum aspects of it, some, but then they know the idealism, but you have the full package here. So, man, it was a pleasure having you on here, and maybe some other time we could go into some other stuff, down the road. That'd be pretty cool.
Yeah, definitely. Maybe you can explore this book in some more depth, maybe. All right.
I'm going to get into that too. Yeah.
Would you mind if I share this on my channel?
Absolutely. Yes, absolutely.
Thank you. I will download this and share it. And I'll probably actually clip the part out about I'll take the death threat part and put that into like its own little mini segment. Like put that up as its own whole thing.
Yeah, a lot of people really enjoyed this, Johan, and St. Beloved says thank you. And also check out his other videos. They are incredible videos too. You put out these amazing videos.
I should tell you, there's a video back, The Autonomous Agents Beneath Spacetime. I didn't mention this, but that actually is kind of inspired by stuff in the Quantum Hermetica as well.
Amazing. And wasn't that before the Quantum Hermetica?
That was just 3 years ago. The Quantum Hermetica was in 2018. Okay. It came out in 2018.
And you were back. So you've been in this Quantum Hermetica for a while, right?
Well, I got interested a couple of years ago. Yeah, when I first finally got around to actually reading the thing.
Awesome. So I'm going to check your videos out, man, and we'll call it a day here and say God bless everyone. We'll catch you soon. Have a good one.
See ya.